Here is the historical context behind the postmodernist art movement, which has its start with the year 1945, goes through the 1970s. The next unit that for this year, 2020, we're not going to get to, starts from 1980 and goes into the 2000s, but we're going to focus on the post-World War II world. And so this is just a map of what the world looked like for the NATO versus the Warsaw Pact and aligned countries. So you can see we've got, these are all Western aligned or colonies even. Look at, these are still considered colonies. The African art, which we've covered, they go through a period of decolonization during this time period, and which is the UN is heavily involved in trying to help the decolonization process, and it just leads to more problems. But here you could see the what the NATO shield covers with all of these blue and light blue areas, and then we have the Soviet Union. This is a little bit lighter of a red. China will be also put under the Soviet Union's kind of block, but it's they'll have a break between the two later on. Here we have North Korea, South Korea, Japan is aligned with the US, obviously. Philippines are, as well as Australia, which Australia and Canada are both former parts of the Commonwealth for Great Britain. Notice the gray are the ones that aren't involved in the Cold War mess, so to speak. India's got its own problems between trying to get freedom in the late 40s from the United Kingdom, and then also there's the creation of Pakistan, which causes big trouble between the two forces of Muslims and Hindus in that region. All right, let's get to some of the actual context I want you guys to know. As most of you who have gotten through World War II in your history classes, Europe and Japan are completely devastated after World War II, and we see the United States accepting a lot of refugees as a result of not just the Holocaust, but also we'll get a lot of people from Europe who are going to be fleeing the destruction of World War II. The nuclear bombs that hit Japan that the United States detonated is really going to begin the Cold War and the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And also it's going to lead to this sense of despair, once again, disillusionment, just like after World War I, and definitely skepticism of our governments. Just to compare the difference between World War I and World War II, World War I, which we have talked about in regards to the disillusionment afterwards as a result of the 10 million people who had died in the war, and then the millions of people died after the war with the Spanish flu pandemic. But after World War II, 35 million people were dead. And so that's a much higher casualty rate than the First World War. And also it leads to 40 million people who are displaced. And that means that they don't have a home, or there's no home to go back to. Their towns were bombed, their cities were destroyed. And so that's going to lead to the relocation of artists, and a lot of them go to the United States. And that's really going to make New York becoming the center of the art world for the artists who are fleeing Europe. So we're seeing that shift from Paris being the head to New York being the center of the art world. So World War II, we see the world I talked about before dividing up into the spheres of influence between Soviet controlled versus US controlled. And so that's going to be a big issue throughout the next 50 plus years. For the United States, since we're going to be focusing so much on U.S. events, the civil rights movement in the 1960s is going to begin. And then we have the women's liberation movement, which is sort of an offshoot of the civil rights movement in the 1970s. The Vietnam War, and the fact that the Vietnam War was broadcasted on only three major networks because they only had three channels in the 1970s. That's going to lead to protests and eventually the United States losing the Vietnam War. And then we also have well, by the way, and it's called the American War in Vietnam. At the heart of the conflict was the desire of the North Vietnamese, which had defeated the French administration, who had been their colonial oppressors up until 1954. They wanted to unify under a single communist regime. They had the support from China and the Soviet Union. However, the South Vietnamese government fought to preserve a Vietnam that's more closely aligned with the West. So U.S. military advisors first started going in the 1950s. During the JFK administration, they start bringing not just military advisors, but active combat units. But after the Gulf of Tonkin incident that happened in August of 1864, we're going to see massive amounts of active combat unit introduced into Vietnam in 1965. By 1969, more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were stationed in Vietnam. The costs and casualties of the war proved too much for the United States to bear. The United States started withdrawing by 1973, and it wasn't until 1975 that South Vietnam falls with a full-scale invasion of the North, and the United States had to evacuate via helicopter, and any of the pro-South Vietnamese supporters were going to escape. They called them the boat people, a lot of them. And so a lot of those people who are South Vietnamese are also going to immigrate into the United States, particularly in California. The U.S. military estimates that between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war, and as many as 2 million civilians died on both sides. But the highest casualty rate, there was 1.1 million North Vietnamese dead along with Viet Cong fighters. Viet Cong means that they were like guerrilla fighters. So, all right, moving on to the counterculture movement, which is, you guys would know, is the hippie movement. And so this was, these are the baby boomers' children. These are the children that were born between 1945 and probably say 1965. So maybe 62, maybe it would be the last of the boomers. I know that there's a specific year, but it's definitely from 45 on throughout the 50s. And so that is going to be, as they come of age, they're coming of age during the Vietnam War. And my dad actually turned 18 in 1972. He wasn't a counterculture. He kind of was later than that. But my husband's father was actually a little bit too older to be the counterculture movement because he was born in 42 or 43. But my husband's uncle, he lived the counterculture lifestyle, and then eventually him and his wife are going to move to Oregon, and they're still pretty cool, even though they're in their late, probably early 70s. Anyway, moving on. The people who are in the counterculture movement, they reject national policies as well as a society that generates them. Young people are going to adopt unconventional dress, manners, habits, and morals. This is definitely the Woodstock generation. There's a deliberately subversive attitude that they have to mainstream standards. It is a completely different way of life between people who are counterculture versus people who are in the main lifestyle of the United States. And they were protesting the lack of well, actually not lack of, but the use of conformity, the expectations their parents put on them. They're the children of the greatest generation who survived the Depression and the war, and sought to create this new life for them, and they just completely rejected it. I don't know if your U.S. teachers told you, but not that many people were technically in the counterculture movement. I mean, if you were a teenager in the late 60s, you weren't necessarily going to live on communes, and there wasn't as much of that as the society may have you think. However, the lifestyles of the counterculture will be totally embedded in movies, TV, and of course music. Music is going to be kind of their main way of expressing their discontent about society. And so the 60s and 70s music are all about, the values of what the counterculture believed. Another thing that happens during this time period is the sexual revolution. And the main reason there's this, revolution in quotations is it really has to do with the widespread creation and use of the birth control pill. Prior to the 1960s, there was very little reliable medication or any kind of reliable way of preventing pregnancies. But since women can now prevent pregnancy through the use of hormone replacement with the birth control pill, that's going to allow for them to not have that fear of a consequence in the form of a child. And so that's part of it. And then in the 70s, with the passing of Roe versus Wade and the legalization of abortion, that's also going to help. I want to just to remind you guys that, people had been having sex before marriage forever, from the beginning of time. And also there had been abortions that have been happening since the beginning of time as well, or child infanticide. This is just ways that makes it not just medically possible, but legal for both of those things to happen. And so it led to less unwanted pregnancies, less children whose mothers don't want them, and safer and better medical care and treatment for women who are pregnant. And so that's just something to think about. Another thing that's really widespread is drug use. Again, people are using drugs way before that. Coca-Cola used to be, like, the main ingredient was cocaine. It used to be legal to buy heroin, cocaine, morphine, the list goes on, marijuana in pharmacies. But after they started experimenting with LSD, which is, a hallucinogenic that caused lots of problems, and then heroin becomes a really big problem in the 1970s. We're going to start seeing the war on drugs begin, and the outlawing of these drugs. And so within the counterculture movement, there is widespread drug use. The most widely used drug was marijuana, and it was illegal back then. And then also the using LSD or acid or other hallucinogenics is also going to be pretty prominent among the counterculture movement. Other people are using those drugs as well, people who aren't counterculture, but it was largely contained to marijuana if you weren't in the counterculture movement. And then the rock and roll, the music is going to be one of the most important parts of the counterculture movement, and still it's going to, like, even make the divide wider between the greatest generation versus the baby boomer generation. Some people dropped out, quote unquote, of regular society, rejected Western university curriculum, and basically saw it as irrelevant. So, okay, so that is the historical context. I could go on and on and on. This is, basically just a crash course of 1945 to 1970s. If you're sophomores, you're going to get this in your junior year. Juniors, you probably are working on it now, and seniors, you already know all this. So Thanks for listening. This is our last historical context for 2020.